and welcome to another episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Nu Fatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Jake and Gwen by Wedgie Lover 109. With me, I have, as always, Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
So glad to be back, as always. Thank you, thank you.
So, to start with, I have a summary. A single wedgie is the catalyst for a family to devolve into people they'd only dreamed of being before, with each exploiting the fetish in their own way and dragging others into the mess.
Nice. It's more positive than one I had written. Might come off a little
What did you have?
insulting. I had a incestuous slash unhealthy relationship where a family exercises their fetishistic pleasures on a growing circle. Far
Okay.
less
I,
complimentary compared to yours.
but I like it just as much. I think it conveys it just as well. So, this was first posted on DA on October 15th, 2017, and collectively with all of the parts, it has over 692,000 views, which is the most amount of views I can see for anything except like Auntie Cherry's list of wedgies, and maybe like something like that. But I'm
Sure.
curious when you first came into this story, where you first found it, and why it grabbed you originally.
Yeah. So like you said, on DA 2017, there weren't many of us seeing it right at first at the time. You'll see there's only like two comments down there. But I remember when it came out and I was flagging it to people because it was really well written and that's something that's always been consistent with it. But I really liked the mother son approach. Like as intense and as incestuous as the story gets, the story's never not been intense. It's always been super deep into psychological realism of what characters are thinking and feeling. Always when it comes to making sure the reader is deriving pleasure from the scene. That's the reason it's so descriptive in a lot of ways. And I was really impressed by that. So I was sort of an early fan of it and an early proponent of promoting it a lot in those early 27 days. It was on a lot of lists I made in 2017 into 2018. Um, that and a story called Marcus and Liz, Steplet Siblings, which to me has a lot of similarities. Step Sibling Wedgies by Bizarre Atomic. Those two were on a lot of lists that I made, sort of promoting new creators because they were both really well written, tackled a lot of similar things. Although, of course, as Bizarre Atomic story title notes, it's about step siblings. So the whole idea of them getting each other off and these like crazy orgies and fetishistic stuff isn't as sort of uncomfortable as a family that's literally like does not shy away from the constant orgies where every member of the family is involved and basically every inappropriate relationship you can think about is like explored in this series, and it's pretty bonkers.
Yeah.
But I think we're gonna talk a lot about that.
Absolutely. And so, as a fair warning to anyone who hasn't read this story yet, it is extremely incestuous between a mother and son. So, if that's something you have no interest in, then this is definitely not the story for you, and you probably won't be interested in this conversation. But yeah, absolutely, it is very creative in sort of exploring the taboos uh, of life. But I would have to disagree with you about it being well written and diving into psychological realism from the beginning. I think as the story goes, it gets better with both of those, and it dives
Sure.
further into both of them. But in the beginning,
Yeah.
I don't think it really is too much either of them,
Yeah.
with just grammatical mistakes and um, uh, what's the word? I can't think of it, but or just some things just aren't quite flowing properly, that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
it definitely gets a lot better, and the parts get longer as the story
Mm.
progresses. So uh, I think the further you get into it, the more worth a read it is.
Yeah, sometimes confusingly so in terms of the length of the parts. Like you'll read one part and they'll be like, "This is part 23 to 26," and you're like, "How and where are you
Yeah.
breaking this up?" And it's the same
Hmm.
length as other. So you can see like the breaks, but you're like, and then someone was like, "Wow, they wrote like 88 parts." I think it was Anime Paintings. He's like, "They wrote like 88 parts to this." I'm like, "Did they though? Like, was that 88 chapters in the story?" Uh, so it does the you're right though. There are parts that are longer, and certainly as it goes, a lot of attention to what characters are thinking and
Yes.
feeling. Mostly and primarily, that's focused on when they're getting a wedgie, and their
Hmm.
thoughts are pretty much all one-track minds around wedgies in any given moment. Because the story really, to me, is well written porn.
Yes,
And it's a series of
absolutely.
very pornographic scenes that you expect to see in porn movies or in stories. And you get this sort of fun meta element, kind of them filming and going into what that looks like, of being a sort of production company. And they get to play out these stereotypical scenes, which is kind of meta, but like every chapter is basically the same thing with
Hmm.
in the characters in the action might change, but there's no real growth to the characters. I'm really jumping ahead here, but I want to try and give you some idea of what I
Yeah.
think of the story so
Yeah.
people how in case they don't want to hear anyone not loving it 100%. I like Wedgie Lover 109. We've chatted. We've as you have too, and as you've told me, like we've talked about RPing together in the
Hmm.
past, and I respect him, and he's had such great success
Yeah.
with the story, and is a great example of someone who's able to really build on a brand and ride the success of it really well and keep audiences interested in it. Like the Inheritance, which we might or might not chat at all about now, is just a Jake and Gwen sequel. Like it starts out with different characters, but Jake and Gwen are in it, and then they're a huge part of it. Not and from the earliest parts of it, where it's a clear there's a little crossover that's fun, but now they're physically there and they're just doing
Hmm.
stuff. It's like their story continues. So it's
Yeah.
a very cool example of across years now since they started this in 2017 to now, building on some characters. And when I say building on, I just mean writing more of them. They
Yes.
feel like the same characters from those first chapters.
Definitely. Just more free. And I think this
I
this
suppose
story
so.
can be described in one word as literotica. It is the
Sure.
truest form
Yeah.
of literotica that I've seen in this
Yeah.
community.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of its success and popularity comes from because you have someone who consistently across every chapter is able to write very erotic
Hmm.
wedgie scenes, and
Yes.
they've nailed a lot of what's important to us, this element of knowing what people are feeling, what I call psychological realism, but what a lot of us just look at is I want to know what they're feeling. I want to be able
Yeah.
to see it and picture it in my head and understand what the wedgie's like. They get that. We consistently always get that in the chapters. We get like an escalation, we get a detail, we don't have a rushed like, and then there was a wedgie. It's
Hmm.
constantly why is a character wanting to do this, and their reasons aren't particularly complicated,
Yeah.
although as it goes they kind of get retconned to be a bit more complicated in some ways, but mostly it's just like they want power, and that's something we understand, this whole sadistic masochistic element of the fetish, and he understands that. He plays into it with the way characters act and the way they speak to each other, and then just a nice mix in that whole thing, a little dash of the tropes and the cliches.
Yes.
Constantly, someone's yelling out, "It's wedgie time!" Constantly. It's a story that uses it probably more than any other story in the entirety of the community's history, and we go
Yeah.
back many years, as you know. So you get that. That's the sort of recipe to the success of the story. But certainly, it's endured because of that consistency of being able to turn people on in every chapter.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with the amount of parts, I think it was pretty clear to me where each part sort of ended and began, if they were grouped together, and I think it seems to be that if there's a grouping of parts, it's because they all focus on a similar idea or setting or that kind of thing. And so I like that quite a bit. So I could see why he would uh, put it as multiple parts, but post them at the same time,
Yeah,
especially if it's
that's supposed to
multiple.
be
Yeah, especially if it's multiple
sure.
viewpoints from different characters.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah, and it would be kind of unwieldy as a reader to have to go through very short couple paragraphs and not a lot, and it's that many posts. I think my main concern is just the numbering felt
Hmm.
arbitrary in some
Yeah.
ways. It's like you didn't have to say each part. Like no one's gonna go, oh, Jake and Gwen part 79 within 78 and 82. That was my 79 was my fear. Like if that's the chapter title of some of them, because some of them are just one part.
Hmm.
If you say 54, some of them have titles which make life easier. You
Yes.
go, oh, after school activities, and you can probably imagine, even if you can't remember what part that is, you can probably guess the teacher, Miss Krause, is there, things of that nature. But certainly, it was to me always been a bit arbitrary in the
Yeah,
numbering. Where it's like,
I
why are
agree.
we at 82 right now? It's like that seems like a lot.
Yeah, I agree. And as far as I could tell, this is one of the longest stories in the community. Just one of the longest running. And you can kind of look at The Inheritance not even as a sequel, but just as a continuation that
Sure.
just focuses on different characters, but then eventually comes back to focus on the original characters. So
Yeah.
you can kind of see it as the same thing, honestly.
I'd say so. Yeah, I'd say so. Like it's the thing is, even if Jake and Gwen weren't in it, it's basically the same story, right?
Yeah.
It's same thing. This mother son relationship, just slightly different
Hmm.
hook. Almost pun intended, since hooks are huge in his stories with Wedge. But I mean, it's just in the case of the inheritance, Jason is rich, and so he gets to do whatever he wants. But I mean, we
Yeah.
have a similar character, the prototype of Justin, the rich boss's son,
Yes.
who gets to do whatever he wants with Gwen anyway. So it's like he was playing with that anyway, and we get it again in the inheritance. And then obviously it comes back to Jake and Gwen and their whole family anyway in the more recent chapters. So it's really
Absolutely.
just it's sort of the same thing, and you're right, a continuation, a retread in some ways of some of that ground. And clearly, as I said, shows that like you can do it, and with great success. It's run basically what's that, like 4 or 5 years or something, 2017 to just their last post in the story was earlier in January. So
Yeah, that's 6 years. All
it's
that's going.
impressive.
It's going on 6 years.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, there was
it's
a
nice.
break, I think. Yeah, so
Yeah.
like last Jake and Gwen part was what 2020, and then Inheritance part one's 2021. So there's like a year break in there. But what do we call that? Three years or something of like building on a story and the
Yeah.
characters. And by building on again, I just mean making it longer. Because
Hmm.
what I'd love to have seen is like actual character growth. The only character growth in any of the characters is finding out they like wedgies. That's the one thing.
Yeah.
And it's like we might understand a bit about why they like them, and we might learn a bit about past events that involved wedgies, like all the stuff with Paul bullying Jake and stuff like that. But it's not character growth. We don't see the characters changing at all, which is what I would love to have seen.
Hmm.
And that's because it's this literotica, like we said. It's a series of wedgie scenes. It's not how is Jake gonna grow as a person and become different. It's what hot wedgie is he gonna give his mom
Yeah.
next. That's the question of every chapter,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing in Inheritance. It's not is he gonna become a better person with this money? Is he gonna change? No, it's how's he gonna wedgie his hot mom next? It's
Hmm.
the same thing. It's
Yeah.
like, and then what wedgie is the mom gonna give the son?
Hmm.
What wedgie is the teacher gonna give the kid? It's like it's on and
Yeah.
on and on.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. But one thing to commend him for is continuing with this basically this single idea for so long. That's and
Sure.
just keeping going with it. Like that's commendable to me because it's so easy to lose interest in idea, especially in this community, and then just drop it and move on to
Yeah.
something else or just stop. So
Yeah.
it's I
And we saw he was stopped for a bit, like a
mhm,
year or whatever, but it's great that he came back and is picking up basically where he left off in a lot of ways, with new characters, but the same sort of central core that's obviously kept an audience and is helping him keep growing as a
mhm,
creator. So it's impressive to keep at it, definitely.
for sure. Yeah, there's I guess moving away from that a little bit, there's some pretty decent human sounding banter and dialogue between the characters,
I
which
agree, yeah.
usually ends up being all of the actual talk about wedgies, though there's just as much, if not more, of the opposite that I found. It a lot of it, when the characters come around to wedgies, the characters seem to come alive and feel actually human versus
Mhm.
in so many of the other situations where there's nothing, where there's no wedgies going on, they don't feel very human, and I think that's a very clear indication of what's actually interesting Wedgie Lover 109 and um, what he's just trying to sort of get through to get to the hot parts.
Yep. Yeah, I certainly felt that. You could tell the dialogue moves from like kind of realistic because characters are talking about things they want to do or just how they feel, and he might cushion some of it with like in the beginning of the inheritance, for example, first chapters, like he spoke the way like a annoyed 21-year-old his age would or something like that, and you're like, so he's like getting you used to it, and you're
Mhm.
quickly learning about the characters in these very like quick ways. um Similarly with Jake, it's like he's clearly feels a certain way about his mom, kind of annoyed, kind of isn't afraid to like joke with her and be kind of whiny as a lot of characters are. Um, so yeah, certainly you get a lot of that, but then also it's a lot of like dialogue you'd expect from a
Yeah,
Wedgie story. It's
absolutely.
not even just in the scenes where it clearly that's the point because they're acting out a Wedgie scene and they're about to do some Wedgie stuff, and or they're living out these fantasies that a lot of us have had, um just in their day-to-day lives before they even get into filming and all that stuff. But then yeah, it's hard to balance, like, as a reader going through that. You're like, how on one moment is it kind of realistic and you can feel it, then the next it's like just lit erotica. So it's
Mhm.
like kind of trying to balance both worlds, I guess. But to me, it's always just strongest and at its most, I guess, core to what it is when it is the sort of lit erotica.
Yeah, absolutely. And even disregarding what they're talking about,
Mm.
I mean more so like if you were to say these things out loud, these lines of dialogue, it would sound like somebody's actually speaking.
Sure.
So
Totally.
this story feels very reminiscent of the early days of Lucky Fetish. One thing is the immediacy of the first wedgie, though
Yeah.
the way it's implemented is pretty unique. We're using a cartoon of a guy getting a comically large wedgie in his tighty whities. And I'm
Yeah.
surprised more people haven't written similar scenarios with how many of us cite cartoons as one of our first exposures to wedgies.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you agree with that or disagree.
Yeah, I think there's something to it. You can definitely, you're right. If you look at Lucky Fish forums in history, that's not the first story to Jake and Gwen, that is, to sort of feature that very similar idea. A cartoon's on, someone's watching it, and then they're inspired to like give a wedgie. I think that's what we saw in the Haynes sisters, I think,
Oh,
but I could
okay.
be wrong. And that's one example, I think, where cartoons are on. There's others I know that are sticking in my head, even if I can't remember the titles, but they'll probably come to me as we're chatting. Where it's on the TV, they have to pause it or something. They're pausing it right on like a wedgie scene or something, and the characters react to that. So it's a fun little like trope we see occasionally, and it certainly makes sense. I mean, obviously, in something like Magni-Pole's story, Haley the bully, one of the last chapters, we have her watching the iconic scene in Fairly Odd Parents,
Hmm.
one of those wedgies, and being like,
Yeah.
and it sticks with her, and we realize then, as we sort of, especially once the twist is revealed in that she was a fetishist all along, and like this is her origin, and that's how we started, a lot of us. So
Hmm.
certainly it's always interesting when you add in some of that realistic details. And like Wedgie Lover 109, to their credit, seems fascinated and preoccupied by some of the psychology of the fetish. Like even in their most recent post, which is like talking about the characters a bit, giving us a little bit of detail about them, but it's kind of vague. Um, they talk about how like Jake getting bullied a lot sort of sent him on this spiral. Or how similarly Jason was like in such a great position, but he sort of retconned, it felt like, the character, because he made a note of like how he never thought he would get a wedgie or something. Whereas like
Hmm.
in the beginning of the Inheritance, it's just a case where like he somehow stumbled on the Jake and Gwen videos, and that's how he got into the fetish, basically. So and other videos, I think. So it's certainly is interesting in how it begins, the fetish. So it is cool for you to pull that out, and this idea of cartoons and that being a good starting place is always fun. And it's how it's that the age old question, right? We're always dealing with as writers. It's like, how do we make this realistic? How do we
Hmm.
set up the scene in a way that makes sense? Clearly, he sort of forgets about that later on, and he's just like, whatever. The teacher's gonna be into it. The boss's son is gonna
Yeah.
be into it. The sister's gonna have been setting up all this stuff, and the boyfriend's gonna be giving them wedgies all the time,
Yeah.
and the list goes on, right? Like
Yeah.
infinitely, and it could, but and it really. But in that early chapter, we do see that attempt to be like, I have to try and make this real. Let's put it on the TV. Let's give a lead up and a build up to it. But
Yeah.
certainly it is much like those early Lucky Fish
Hmm.
forum stories, and much like even stuff we see today on like Wattpad and things, where it's just like two characters are there, wedgies happen, and you're just like, oh,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. The only other one that really came to mind that had that sort of cartoon as um the catalyst for it all happening is Switcheroo by Auntie Cherry. So
Yeah,
the one with the two sisters, and the one wants her twin sister to stand in for and get her a good grade on a test, and then things happen.
yeah.
And so
Yeah, and there they quote. I remember the character
exactly.
quotes the line from Fairly Odd Parents, the
Hmm.
iconic one that a lot of us remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. So yeah, definitely cartoons are weaved into, I think, the fabric of the community and the stories in some ways. Certainly,
Yeah.
anime is obviously in another way had its own impact, but that animation, uh, from that we watched when we were younger, and some of those scenes, especially Fairly Odd Parents, holds a very special place for a lot of the community, uh, as well as some other significant ones. Yeah, definitely. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see how that plays out in
Yeah.
stories back then, and even like more recent.
Definitely. And cartoons weave themselves into our stories, but the I feel like even more so than that, ca- a cartoony nature
Yeah,
weaves itself into this story quite a lot.
yeah, yeah,
But one thing that makes it feel more realistic to our lives is that even if he's barely in the story at all, it is very refreshing to see a dad. That
I agree.
honestly, it feels more rare to have that than older
Yeah,
women.
yes, yeah, totally. Yeah. It's funny. I had somebody reach out the other day, ask me like, "Are there any good mother son wedgie stories, or mother daughter like that?" And I think it was mother daughter they were looking for. And I showed them like one of mine. But I was thinking to myself like, yeah, that I haven't done a lot of like mother daughter wedgie stuff or like this mother character. Like you might have these stand-ins obviously, or you'll do a lot of step siblings, same age stuff. So like when you start talking about parents and their kids, it it becomes a lot more rare, especially if it's like they're not stepmother, stepson, which is kind of expected and I think a really popular porn category in general, like step
Mhm.
relations. So and then yeah, when you think about a dad being in it, that's so great. Like YWNR has a guy in it and he like says nothing and he's the
Yeah.
dad, but he's like so absent after the very beginning. I love in friend sessions that there's a dad, although he's quite terrifying. And Anime Pains doesn't understand that we viewers think he is. It's kind of funny because he doesn't see it, but he's quite terrifying as a figure. Um, and you know, when we've chatted before, I went on at length about how men seem to fall into these roles of like a strict, sort of frightening figure, a la kind of what we see in Jake and Gwen. Like, he comes in, ruins the fun, and then starts giving like brutal, brutal wedgies out. And he's just so
Mhm.
like he's like weirdly manipulated into it where like I have to go harder to try and break him out of this, which is very porny in itself, you know. We've
Yeah.
seen that set up in a ton of videos. A lot of Roxy Ray videos where they go the wedgie therapist. The therapist is like, to cure you of your wedgie love, I must give you very, very hard wedgies. I'm like, that's a very
Yeah.
familiar trope. So it's just now it's a guy doing it. But it is cool, and the one thing I like too about these stories is like there is a guy in them. There's Jake who's in them, and the young guys aren't super rare, but it's not as common on like a Lucky Fish forums, obviously, where males are rare in general, or like a Wedgie Buddies, where it's MM primarily, with some FM being a very rare and always very popular exception to content that people really like and they're really hungry for, which I think is why this story does so well in particular, as well as the continuation. But seeing a dad there, although he's pretty undeveloped, I think he only gets a name much later, right? And I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure one of the only journals he made, Wedgie Lover 109, is to be like, I didn't name the dad. I don't know if I should. Like,
Yep.
I didn't really think about it. And you're like, so men are all often afterthoughts in a lot of these stories, especially when they're not the ones primarily giving or getting the wedgies. But it was refreshing to certainly see a father character, even though he comes in a little bit, has a kind of significant role, and he's gone again. It's
Mhm.
like, well, at least he was there for a bit. He
Yeah.
got to be in the wedgies, which is kind of rare.
Yeah, and he was also very, very lately sprinkled in the very early beginnings of the story.
Yeah,
Just
it's true.
mentioned here and there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
like he's in the second part, I believe, after when Gwen wants to talk to Jake about that huge wedgie that he gave her. That
yeah,
when Jake is so disrespectful to his dad, and then she makes an excuse for him. She wants to go talk to him. Um,
yeah,
he's there, but it's still it's nice to see. Um,
yeah,
and then on the flip
totally.
side of that, we have Gwen, who is a very present mother,
Yeah,
but she's clearly not a good parent to Jake. She's trying way harder to be a friend, and in that way, she
yeah.
reminds me of Pam from Sore Winter.
Yeah. Yeah, what a great comparison. Wow, that's a deep cut. I love it. Yeah, and it's something we chat about at length with her, right? And that's the problem that we see. And it's a fascinating sort of familial issue, but it's one that makes sense from a wedgie story perspective of like what dynamic are we going to find appealing as readers or as
Yeah,
writers? And it makes sense that's like, well, it also explains why the wedgies would sort of happen. It's like it's not really a punishment you're giving to your kid. It's like I want to come to their level. Like this is, and it speaks to that cartoony aspect of the fetish too. It's like this is a high schooler collegey tradition. It's a trope of that world. So me, I'm older. I'm beyond it. Gwen, in her history, we know only sort of saw them and would laugh from a distance. She never really got them or anything, but she knew about them. She saw them. and now she's sort of returning to that world and almost de-evolution of who she is to get to Jake's level to try and mend a relationship with him or build one where she's more of a friend. And obviously that doesn't really work out. It's not really healthy or good for a lot of reasons. She has to pay
Yeah.
for it now constantly. Although she seems to like where she's at, having this very sexual relationship with her son that is really intense, and you would kind of hope leave them with some scars. Like when Jake moves out, he's kind of like, "Wow, I did all this stuff with my mother for years and years and whatever long." It's like, I don't know. I think you're taking some trauma with you there, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot that should happen as consequences, but we
Yeah,
unfortunately don't see.
no, not yet. The story's still going. Maybe in a later chapter, they'll all be in therapy,
Yeah.
and the therapist will be into wedgies too, and it'll be a whole group
Oh,
family wedgie orgy. That would
yeah.
be not unexpected.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, that's if the inheritance is ever finished, or if it meets the same end as Jake and Gwen, then we'll discuss it. But while it's still flowing full force, I
Yeah,
think for the moment it's something to wait and enjoy.
sure.
So Wedgie Lover 109 is really talented at writing detailed wedgie scenes.
Yep.
It's very easy to visualize basically everything happening during them. And really,
Yeah.
I think if they put as much effort into telling the rest of the story, this would probably be a masterpiece. But because of that, we're able to see where they place their focus because of that.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny when you compare a wedgie scene to a non-wedgie scene, just like the difference in writing, and
Yeah.
even if on the surface level they appear to be equal, it's still like, I could still feel the the I guess the uncaring uh, nature that the writer has towards those scenes versus what they're actually interested in.
Yeah, I think they know what the readers want. I wonder, like, if they were to try and change it and introduce like deep character growth and all the characters and have them moving on in whatever form this takes away from wedgies into some other interests, like how that would go with the audience if they're like, no, why ain't no one say wedgie time, they have to say it every chapter, why no atomic or something. Like, I'd probably be like that too, right? Because I know I can click on any chapter of Jake and Gwen, and there's gonna be almost any chapter. There's gonna be a hot wedgie scene, and it's gonna be pretty straight to the point.
Hmm.
There's gonna be some dialogue that fits and works well, and there's gonna be the build up, and there's gonna be descriptions of how turned on everyone is, and it's gonna be good. I'm gonna enjoy it. I'm gonna get off to it. And certainly, it feels all like the story revolves around that. So everything you're feeling, I think, is a byproduct of that. Like when a story is the porn literotica, you limit what you can do, you limit what you can take away from it in some ways, and as readers, you're sort of only able to look at it like that in some ways. And we can talk and look at some of these interesting relationships that are they're all problematic, and we can try to pick out more, but it's gonna be hard because it's always this wall of like it feels like it's just an interest in turning people on.
Yeah.
uh and it obviously there's it like you the more we can try to pull on it, we can say, oh, but maybe there's some deeper elements in Jake and Gwen around the fetish, but there it's not much that's explored. It's like, what hot scene can they have next?
Yeah.
Like, there's no consequences, like we said, no interest in them at all. It's like Rebecca blackmails them into sort of making videos and making her money, and they make a successful business. It's like we don't even see
Yeah.
like a struggle to making a business. You know what I mean? Like there's no like competition or something. They're instant hits. Like we don't get any of that side of it. Like
Yeah.
Wait, like you know what I mean? It's just straightforward,
Absolutely.
wedgie, wedgie, wedgie every time. So it certainly feels kind of hollow, so to speak,
Yeah.
the story in some ways.
Even if things don't always work out for the characters in the end, it always works out for us, the readers.
Yeah, exactly. And you're left feeling like everything's working out for the characters.
Yeah.
Like Jake, even though he's getting brutal wedgies in the beginning from Paul, he's super into it.
Yep.
Like he's super turned on, and then he's able to then give a wedgie later, and he's still super turned on. He's just perpetually horny, as like all the
Yep.
characters are. It's like Gwen has to deal with this annoying boss's son, Roger's son, Justin, but she's still enjoying the whole thing because she's just into it. And it's like that same thing. The teacher, and the list goes on. It's like even if
Yep.
things are like Jake's gonna get a hard wedgie this time, like he's always gonna enjoy it. There's never a moment where Jake's like, "Oh, this is too many wedgies. Like I'm having too much of this. Like I don't want it." It's no. It's like
Mhm.
bring on more and more and more, and that's
Yep.
and he keeps it fresh enough for the readers so we're still interested. But certainly to me, the stories felt repetitive in some ways.
Absolutely. Yep. 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 And one way it shows this repetition, not in itself, but in following other stories, is in the trope of characters checking themselves out in reflective surfaces, which shows
I
up
caught that
for the
too.
first
Yeah,
time in parts
yeah,
7 to 10, though it does show up later again. But the context surrounding that thing from Gwen really
yeah.
makes it the most logical of any story that I've seen. It
Mm,
makes the most sense for it to actually happen in the story there.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny, and I'd forgotten this till just right now. But we talked about cartoons in the beginning and the setup, and I mentioned Marcus and Liz step siblings, which is very similar in a lot of ways. It's funny because that one has a very similar start with Marcus, the wedge fetishist, watching the Simpsons cartoon, and it pauses on Bart Simpson and a hanging wedgie. So
Mm,
that's like that trope that we're talking about. And this was like 2018, so a bit after the inheritance comes out. And Marcus is, as the writer of Bizarre Atomic pointed out, just like a self-insert of them. So it's interesting, and we can wonder like how much is someone like a Jake a self-insert of like Wedgie Lover 109 potentially, although may not be at all close. That's the thing with reading biographically. But
mhm.
it is very interesting to look at some of this and think about how it's written and the fact it has this enduring popularity when really when I look at it it's just like the same story over and over and over again. And that's good, and it's kind of scary for writers who would be like, oh, like, what about the characters growing and things? Like, you don't have to worry about any of that, and you're gonna have some success. It seems, um, but you also wonder like, what's next for these characters, and you want to see them grow as
Yeah.
readers too.
Yep. And that's sort of the trope, the trap that I saw Saseda fall into.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great point because that's the trap of the sort of edui verse. I think is how it's pronounced, where all those characters are pretty one note.
Mhm.
And I've tried in the efforts I've done to try and evolve the few characters I've introduced to it. Sometimes to not great effect. Like even Alice, the character, the giant of a character who has a very sensitive butt. That's her one weakness.
Mhm.
Super good at giving wedgies, super strong. I wrote a story really early, one of the first things I posted on DA, where I tried to paint her as a sensitive, misunderstood sort of character who thought very deeply but couldn't always articulate it and gave very hard wedgies and stuff. And that didn't really go anywhere to this day. But then I made like a character Mia who is in a relationship with one of the other characters, and it's such a cool opportunity to play with a bunch of the other characters in that world that everybody knows. And I've was had a lot of ideas for how to evolve her and change things over time, but certainly so many of those characters are the same, and they're used for this purpose of like
Yes.
just turning on the readers in very short stories, like Monique and her very hot sister April, things like that. And there's very good stories with them. And it's just, how is the hot sister gonna pick on her little sister,
Hmm.
who's nerdier and wears like the nerdy underwear and
Yeah.
things, or Carol with her chocobo underwear, who like is
Sandra.
always the same. Sandra with her giant moons,
Yeah.
not butt cheeks, moons, as they're always described and things.
Yep.
And certainly, and it's just like some characters are obsessed with her butt, and maybe they'll get into a relationship or something. But the core of their characters, like Sandra, who loves tacos and is always going to get wedgies from everybody. It's like
Hmm.
they're the same. And I
Yeah.
think people like that because it's cartoony. It's the episodic sitcom-y element that made Between Two Cheeks such a hit, cuz he captured that, what he even called out as Sunday Saturday morning cartoons, right? And like he wanted his story to be that, and people loved him for it.
Yeah.
Loved him for it.
Yeah.
And so it's exactly what you brought up when you're talking about cartoons and the role they play in sort of permeating the content the community makes, but also what's popular, what we really gravitate towards as readers. And for a lot of us, it is that series of cartoony scenes. It's in Between Two Cheeks. It's what giant, like, they're gonna go to a Comic Con. They're gonna be a wedgie. There's gonna be a bully scene, and it goes on and on and on.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's like how the Saturday, like you said, Saturday morning cartoons, like monster of the week, villain of the week. This is Wedgie of the week.
Wedgie of the week, you got it. And that's it. That's Jake and Gwen. That's Inheritance. It's like they come out almost weekly, the Inheritance chapters, and you're like, what Wedgie are they gonna get this time? Who's
Yeah.
gonna get? Who's gonna get? That's the question.
Yeah. But I think it can be fun to just have that sometimes.
Certainly, we need it. We absolutely 100% we need it. The community cannot be one thing, or it's not a community. It would be some kind of weird, just everyone's the same. They're all writing stories like I write or like you write, and it would be a disaster. Right? It'd be
I
terrible.
mean,
We need the Jake and Gwens.
I
We
mean,
need everything.
I would love that, but that diversity of the variety of content
You got it.
is so
You got it.
important for because people
You
pull
got it.
from so many different things. They're inspired by things they never would have imagined or influenced in ways that
Yeah,
they're not aware of, and so
you
I've
got it.
absolutely, like you and I, like, despite how real and raw we get with our stories, and especially me, all the time with that.
Sure.
So many of our influences and inspirations come from stories like this.
Yes. Absolutely. I'm still inspired by this story. I read it and I see how popular it gets, and I get jealous and I go, I wish I could consistently write a story this focused on the wedgies, that's that
Yeah,
direct to the point and captures a lot of what we want. It's not easy to do. And I'm clearly, as I start writing, my preoccupations with other things focus in. And it's hard for me to write like this sort of pure literotica without very quickly being like, but what if I talk about the human condition? And it's like,
yeah,
nah, not a lot of people want to read about that.
yep,
They want to read about the big atomic wedgies. So like it's definitely tricky to balance it, and Wedgie Lover 109 pushes aside the struggle, it seems. It's just like, I'm gonna give you a really hot story.
hmm,
And like every week or however long it is, you can come here, you're gonna get that.
yep,
And that's very impressive and
yeah,
very hard to
absolutely,
do. And not many people can do it. There's people who try with the same sort of thing, either Edgewiaverse characters, these sort of very sitcom animated kind of characters, OCs, so to speak, or different kind of Inheritance, Jake and Gwen like characters who are more real to life, more we'd expect to meet them on the street. But they don't either have like the amount of content, the amount of stories and characters and wedgies that happen, or they don't have that same attention to turning the audience on, and they can't do it every time in every chapter like
yeah,
Would You Lover 109 can. So they're a very rare pinnacle in a what we could call a sort of subgenre of wedgie fetish fiction, which is pure literotica, pure the porn side of it, so to speak.
yep,
Almost as porny. The only thing more porny, I guess, would be if the scenes were even more contrived, or there was like slightly less attention to the fetish and how it develops in characters, and they just went into these scenes with almost no setup. But it's almost there, and you can feel it.
Yeah, absolutely. So going along with that, part 20, Gwen's First Atomic, is that's honestly the hottest piece of literature I've
Yeah,
ever read in this community.
super
It
hot. Yeah,
so perfectly captures the sexual feelings that come along with this fetish. And
yeah.
like one of the most important aspects of it to me and why I enjoy it so much is like the phrases that are used. So like,
Yeah.
why are these specific phrases like wedgie time and like these specific words like undies? Why are they so important for so many of us?
Yeah. What a good question. I don't know. What do you think?
Hmm. I honestly don't have a clue, so all I can do is spitball, and maybe something will stick. Maybe what it is like seeing it in the story, like actually happen in the story, like these things being said, because so much of it of what those kinds of stories end up being is a sort of wish fulfillment.
Yep.
Uh, we want to have those kinds of things said for whatever reason. Maybe it's something like uh, probably the majority of us are in some way interested in BDSM and like some aspects of that tie roll over into wedgies like this especially I guess specifically the DNS side of it, the domination submission. So many of these phrases are uh, either characters dominating other characters or characters submitting to other characters. And there's just something so sexual and so grabbing about those phrases, but I honestly don't know.
I think that's great. I think you probably hit a lot on the head right there. It's hard to know why these sort of like where they begin and who are the first to sort of think things like wedgie time, or because it obviously comes from the long running joke of like, what time is it?
Yep.
And you see that in so many early Lucky Fish stories, and Auntie Cherry has it right in some
Oh,
early
yeah.
ones. And a character's like, I don't know. And it's always wedgie time. It's like, it's always. So now it's become such a cliche of the community. So I think that's, we see it and something about it sticks. I think because it's funny when we read a lot, and even if you haven't, if you're reading some stories for the first time, there's things and there's lines that are really going to do it for you. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
When we're talking about literotica, there's going to be those moments that when you're really deep in the story, and very aroused, your mind, at least mine does, it will latch on to certain lines and sayings that come up that sort of really build your enjoyment and really make you feel it. So lines like "it's wedgie time" is clearly one of those for Wedgie Lover 109, and the more he uses it, the more there's emphasis built around it. There's more, we're almost like conditioned as readers to expect it,
Mhm.
and conditioned to be like, when it comes, the characters are becoming, basically, so to speak. Um, so stuff like that, certainly, I think it is just that history of seeing it from wherever it starts. Probably also cartoons. I'm assume if we were to look deep enough, we'd find examples of it being used in animation to start, and then writers adopting it, and then spreading like a virus into all the stories. And I think I've used it a handful of times, probably more in my own stories. So
Yeah.
certainly not like immune to the cliches. I've used many of them. I played on some of them, like cuts like a knife, things like that. You
Yeah.
know, I love though that you bring up this idea of Wedgie's connection to BDSM. I've talked at length with you about this. Like,
Mhm.
I feel fetishes in general are linked to sadism and masochism, domination, submission. Like, somebody wants to be in power, somebody doesn't want to have that. I think that's a base sexual desire everyone feels at some level. Sex is power. You want to have it, or you want someone to sort of exercise it on you and take away your power. It's
Yeah.
such a fundamental human thing. And then the interesting thing too with wedgies is it's a bondage tool. And we
Yes.
sometimes forget about that, but at its core it's like it's a bondage element. So we are like entrenched and interlinked with BDSM as a
Absolutely.
fetish, as a culture, as a community in a very core way. So when we see things like an atomic and the under is over the head and you're sort of trapped there and you're bound and you've been dominated by somebody, it's all connected. It's all played into,
Yeah.
certainly.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it would be interesting if we were to hear from Wedgie Lover 109 if they remembered the first time they heard Wedgie Time and why it sort of stuck with them so much. But certainly there's these things and elements, stuff like the Wedgiesaurus, for example, a very cartoony monster the community latches onto. And then we get waves of stuff. Like you remember a couple of years back when centaur wedgies were the
Yep.
biggest thing ever. They're
Yep.
huge, you know. So it's funny that we get these sub trends. Like somebody does something, it really catches with the community, and you see a lot of it
Yes.
with big
And
writers trying it and
I
things,
I
and
would
everyone
I
across
would
it.
be remiss if I did not bring up that Arc Time completely disagrees with everybody else's interpretation of the Centaur Wedgie for whatever reason,
Yeah.
even though everybody else's interpretation actually looks like a legit centaur and his doesn't.
Yeah. It's
um, but
fascinating, you know?
yeah, I mean,
But I mean, even looking back on Lucky Fish forums, just to quickly end that thought, like, even back in stories from 2011, so this means stuff probably from the old board,
mhm,
people were using the expression wedgie time and they were yelling it. So, I mean, it's been around for a long time, and it seems to get like a new lease on life in something like a Jake and Gwen stories.
yes,
But there's a lot of those cliches. It'd be fun for someone to collect them one time and gather those very familiar tropes of dialogue. There's a lot. Like obviously we get that cartoony dialogue, and you get a lot of that in his stories with the crazy letters mixed together, like people going "Gwa la la," you know, like it's "Wah ga ga," you're like, what? No human being would make that sound in life, and when I do it, it sounds like I'm dying. You know, so
sounds like you're
like
uttering a spell.
yeah, that's what it looks like. And you read some of that Jane Gwen, you're like, how's that supposed to sound? You can't hear it. You're taken out of it. You know, or you
Yeah.
think, oh, they're in Harry Potter land now or something. They're in
Yeah.
Hogwarts. You know, no,
Yeah, I mean,
no.
a lot of those cliches and tropes, as you so rightfully labeled them, I kind of see them as like Pokerus. If you're thinking about like Pokemon,
Hmm.
where one of the I think the only disease that I know of in Pokemon is this thing called Pokerus, where if a Pokemon is infected with it, it's only beneficial. They their stats increase faster. They are more powerful with it. So I kind of see them
Mm.
as that. Like I think we're better with so many of these, but they can very easily be overused and all that. But
Yeah.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
you look at a wedgie, a single one. It basically encompasses the entirety of BDSM because you have
Yeah.
bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism, and a single one fits all six of those. I think
Yeah.
you'll sometimes have ones that don't quite fill them, but for the most part, there's just like there's really no getting away from BDSM with this. And
Totally.
yeah.
Totally.
Now, parts 23 to 26 have the only explanation of a group watching a wedgie happen that makes sense in the real world that I've seen. Quote,
Mm.
and even though he didn't have a personal opinion on Luke as a human being, he was not only rooting for the wedgie to continue, but for it to escalate. It wasn't that he wanted to see Luke suffer individually. He was just rooting for the wedgie itself as a conceptual process, not only because he was turned on by their existence, but also to decrease what he saw as the alien nature of wedgies. He figured that if wedgies were to become a more everyday occurrence, and if he were to ever be exposed, the social damage would be lessened. Or at least that's what he theorized. That makes complete sense as to like why it would happen in real life. And it's I've seen a couple of other explanations and stories, but this one makes the most sense for real life.
Yeah. And it's funny that he leaves before watching it, and he kind of gives a little reason, like he doesn't want to get wedgies anymore. But then clearly he goes on to want to get a bunch,
Yep.
and it's like it's a bit of a missed opportunity there in some
Mm.
ways. Although he's trying to say something about his
Hmm.
character, although
I
it doesn't really go anywhere. You know what I mean?
I feel
But
like that is interesting. I feel like it's just I feel like that is a character growth moment where before he would have just stayed and done whatever, but because he's I guess been empowered by being able to implement wedges in his own life in a way that he wants, Jake is able to step away from something that he would have joined in automatically with, and now he's able to take what he fantasizes and imagines would happen while watching that scenario and turn it into life.
yeah, you would hope that's exactly what it was, but then even in the next chapter, he has to, and it's from the story. The quote is like, accept his role as Gwen's personal wedgie bitch. So it's like, where's the empowerment? Where is him being like a moment ago he doesn't want to watch the flagpole wedgie because he wants to give wedgies. He has it in his own life,
Yeah,
and he goes the very next chapter to being someone's personal wedgie bitch. You're like, so
yeah,
I understand 100% what you mean, but it is this like it's he touches like, oh, maybe here's a moment where the character is gonna change and grow. Like you could even have sort of capped off the story. He doesn't watch a flagpole wedgie. He goes home. He maybe takes on this role of like he's not gonna be bullied anymore, but that doesn't go anywhere. It's like he's
yeah,
clearly into being bullied, and that's something he's going to go on to get happen to him throughout the story. And it's just like with that in mind, you look back, you're like, why didn't he just watch it and then go home? Like best of both
yeah.
worlds. Like what fetishist is gonna miss that? And like not Jake, who's so obsessed with wedges. That's all he thinks about. You know,
Yeah, fair point.
it's
That's a
really
very fair
wild.
point. Very fair point.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And it's interesting though that he does throw in this flagpole wedgie. It's not Jake getting it. It's his friend we don't see a lot of, and he's watching it, and we don't get details on like who's giving it to him or why they're doing it. It's just sort of there, like a fantasy almost, and that's what
Mhm.
a lot of the story feels like, fantasies of the characters, and it's the sort of direct pornographic sort of scenes
Yes.
that we don't entirely get elsewhere because we have some setup and we have some talk about characters wanting to do something and why they want to do it and how they feel about what's happening and the change in their relationship to being so sexual and things like that. Here it's just like, no, here's a flagpole wedge.
Yeah.
This is happening.
Yep.
And Jake's into it, but he's left. And you're like, yo. I guess you save it though for another instance. There could be a flagpole wedgie somewhere later in the story now, and they
Yeah.
haven't used it up.
Yep.